Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us for this first comparative economics webinar with Professor Sergei Guriev presenting on 3G internet and confidence in government. Before introducing him, let me just point out that if you have any questions, please use the questions and answers Q&A facility at the bottom of your screen. And after the talk, please raise your hand and we will unmute you so that you can ask your question. Let me briefly introduce Sergei then. It's a huge pleasure to have Professor Sergei Guriev here launching this webinar series. Sergei is currently Professor of Economics at Sciences Po in Paris, and he was the former rector of the New Economic School in Moscow and former chief economist of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in London. It's a huge pleasure to have you here, Dan. Thank you very much, Sergei. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Naura. And I will try to share my screen now. And it's, it's a great honor and pleasure to speak, to be the first speaker in your seminar, which already has an impressive lineup of speakers to follow this week's presentation. I'm going to speak about this paper co-authored with Nikita Melnikov and Ekaterina Zhuravskaya, both of whom are online, and hopefully they will be answering your clarification questions if you have any. And the paper is about 3G internet and confidence in government. So I hope you can see my slides now. Yeah, it seems to work. So basically this paper is about the relationship between penetration of internet, expansion of broadband internet access around the world, and political implications. And you have several camps in this debate. There are optimists who talk about internet as a liberation technology or accountability technology, which has two dimensions actually. There is an argument that internet helps informing people, help in increasing transparency. And on the other hand, internet, like any coordination public good, helps to overcome collective action problem during the protests. And we'll talk about that in the paper as well. Now, there is also a pessimistic view, of course, that new social media are also a misinformation technology. They help facilitating fake news or false news, of misleading narratives. They also empower non-democratic regimes by giving them technology for not just propaganda, but also surveillance, and also create opportunities for populists whose message is propagating more easily in a sense than the message of centrist mainstream politicians. So this debate is very important, obviously, but interestingly, there is no one single paper which looks at a global setting. Most papers in this debate are single country studies. There is one multi-country study which looks at Africa by Manacorda and Tessay. It's forthcoming in Econometrica, and it looks at the spread of 2G mobile networks, second generation mobile networks, and they show that there is a causal effect from 2G mobile networks to increase of political protests in Africa. So they look at African continent. Now we look at the global setting, we look at the whole world, and we also look at the next stage of expansion of internet. We look at third generation mobile internet. So that is a time period which is after Manacorda and Tessay's time period, but we also using the global setting, we can actually look at the mechanisms, because we look at very different places that have very different political institutions, very different media freedom arrangements and censorship arrangements. And so we probably can do a bit more. Also, we look at Europe. We zoom in on Europe, where we study elections, and we try to see to what extent 3G expansion in the last decade actually had an impact on electoral outcomes. So this is the contribution of the paper. The results are fourfold. First and foremost, the takeaway from this paper is if you get access to third generation mobile services, you will be less likely to like your government. And so this is something that is, of course, consistent with the liberation technology view or accountability technology view, where this effect should be stronger when internet is not censored, but traditional media is censored. So internet is a channel for keeping the politicians accountable. Now, of course, effect is weaker if online media are censored. And so we look at online censorship as well. And we do find that in countries where online media are censored, there is no relationship. Now, we also look at the relationship between actual misgovernance and perceptions of misgovernance. So what we do, we look at various ways we can measure the actual corruption, and we see that internet helps to expose actual corruption. So these are the places where you have more internet, where people notice actual corruption, where there is a correlation between actual corruption and perceived corruption. Now, as I mentioned, in Europe, we look at elections, not just at surveys of perceptions of government. We look at performance of incumbents in European elections in the last decade. And we find that in those subnational regions where you have faster expansion of 3G internet, greater penetration of 3G internet, incumbents are more likely to lose their vote share. But however, we see that not every opposition party benefits. The parties that benefit are actually the populist parties. Non-populist parties who are in opposition do not benefit. In particular, we look especially at the green parties, and we find that 3G internet doesn't benefit, for example, green parties. Green parties are an important placebo because it's also an anti-system movement, but it's a very different kind of anti-system movement from populists. So since I only have 60 minutes and already actually 53 minutes, let me skip the literature. I can only point to a very important survey in the annual review of economics by my co-author Katya Zhuravskaya, Maria Petrova, and Ruben Nikolopov, which looks at the impact of new media, of internet on various political implications and democracy. But in general, there are quite a few of studies which we refer to in our paper, which look at specific countries, Italy, Germany, Malaysia. And one of those studies is very important. That's a study by Campante, Durante, and Sobria, which you've probably seen, which tells you a story how the rollout of broadband internet in Italy initially had a negative impact on turnout, and then later on had a positive impact on populist vote share on the 5-star movement. In a sense, this is a related paper, but we do, as I said, a study which looks at a global setting or at a European setting. So this is the roadmap. I will briefly talk about the data. I'll talk about empirical specifications. I'll talk about average results, that heterogeneity of the results, mechanisms, and at European elections. So our main outcome comes from Gallup World Poll. So Gallup World Poll data start in mid-2000s, but it is actually in 2008 when you first have reasonable coverage of the world. And so we look at 10 years of Gallup World Poll, and we look at subnational regions within 100+ countries, where we look at the perceptions of people responding to the Gallup World Poll, whether you have confidence in government, in judiciary system, in elections, or do you think that government is corrupt? So this will be the 4 questions which we'll look one by one, but also aggregate. And these are our outcomes in terms of perception of the government, confidence in government, and so on. Now, we also look at the question from the Gallup World Poll, which is internet access. And so it's a question, again, yes or no question, where we can actually see if rollout of 3G has an impact on access to internet. Now, when we look at Europe, we just look at election results, where we also look at subnational regions. And we look at 33 European countries, 12 years. Here we are not constrained by the Gallup data, but here we are constrained by our 3G data, which I'm going to introduce shortly. And there we have about 100 elections in those democracies. So on average, every country has about 3 elections, and basically we run a panel within those 12 years. So on average, we'll have 2 or 3 elections per country or per region. And then we classify populist parties and look at populist, non-populist, green, and other parties' vote shares. So the 3G data come from a consulting company called Collins Bartholomew's, which has a data set which gives you 3G and 2G and actually 4G coverage of all countries in the world. And so we can actually tell you, or they can tell us, whether at each particular grid cell there is coverage by 2G, 3G, and 4G. And we look at 3G for the reason that will become clear later. But generally, the simple answer is 3G really matters for political perceptions. 4G probably matters even more, but 4G is still a recent technology. And 2G has a different impact. We'll talk about that. Now, if you look at our data set with the Gallup World Poll, we talk about 800,000 individuals, 2,000 subnational regions, 100 plus countries for 10 years. So these are the numbers, if you like. So let me actually skip that since I don't have much time. And in the European data set, we have about 400 subnational regions and about 1,200 region election observations. And for the observation, we have data on which party got how many votes, and we also have data on turnout. We'll talk about that as well. Now, we also use data on censorship, as I mentioned, which come from Freedom House. And this is censorship of traditional media, but also censorship of online media. We also, as I said, need to know actual corruption. So we need to figure out whether people dislike their government because government is bad, or because opposition is very effective and criticizes, in a smart way, criticizes a good government. And so in order to understand that, we actually look at actual corruption data. And so we use 2 strategies here. One comes from IMF index called Global Incidence of Corruption, which I'm going to talk about later. But basically, it's a measure of corruption scandals in a country reported by a consultancy, Economist Intelligence Unit, to investors. And so it's a subscription-based service, and we believe that this is a reasonably high-quality data set. IMF has compiled this index and was kind enough to share with us. And then we also use Panama Papers leak, when a lot of people suddenly learned quite a bit about corruption in their own countries in 2016. So we treat it as a shock of figuring out that there is actual corruption going on in your country. So I promised to Naura that as in his opening slide, he has maps with dots. We also have maps with dots here. So this is the coverage of the world by 3G networks in 2007. And you see that there are whole countries which had no 3G. And there are many young people in the profession, they can't believe that, but these are the data. And so this is our data set in 2007. Now there are white areas here, such as Kazakhstan or China. These are the countries which are not covered by Gallup. So if you want me to tell you what's going on with confidence in Chinese government, this is not, unfortunately, the data set that can help us. So this is the end of our period, 2018, where 70% of the world lives in areas which has access to 3G. And you see that the whole Europe is covered pretty well, except for Spain, and the whole of the US and the populated areas of Canada are covered pretty well. But there is still a lot of variation around the world in 3G, even today. So this is the subnational regions definition. So we have we use Gallup's definition of subnational regions. Then we match those subnational regions to grid cells of mobile data. And this is the map which shows you both the division into subnational regions and the change in coverage by 3G. So our important variable will be the share of the population in a subnational region that lives in a place which has 3G access. Or you can define it differently. You can say the share of the region covered by 3G network weighted by population. But basically, it's all about access to 3G population weighted. So our main regression will be government approval as a function of 3G, and we have lots of controls here. So we look at the level of development, which could be average household income in the subnational region. In some robustness checks, we also look at nightlight satellite data, probably which were the picture in the Nauros and Michael's opening map for the seminar. We also control for region fixed effects, year fixed effects. In some specifications, we also control for country year fixed effects. We also use an IV strategy where we predict 3G by frequency of lightnings in a given region. This is the strategy which comes from Manacorda and Tessé paper, who use this IV strategy, arguing that if you have more lightnings in this particular place, the internet infrastructure will be rolled out later rather than sooner, because it's just harder to do that. And so they multiply lightning by time. So 3G in our case and 2G in their case, but 3G in our case arrives a bit later. Now we divide this effect into effect for rich countries and poor countries, in particular for the reasons I'll discuss later. Basically, to jump ahead, this instrument really works well for poor countries, not for rich countries, and this is consistent with Manacorda and Tessé, who only look at Africa. Anyway, let me stop here. I've been talking for about 15 minutes. Do you have questions? You want to ask questions? No?
I don't know if there are any questions.
Okay.
No.
Okay, let me go ahead. Yes. Okay. So this is the main result where we show the correlation between increase in the share of the region's territory covered by 3G. So, and this is the access to internet around the. So it's not the main result. It's this relationship here, this equation here, where we actually check if 3G network coverage increases internet access. And so it does. And basically, it's not a one-for-one relationship. So if you move from 0 access to 3G to 100% access to 3G, your internet access changes by about 8 percentage points. It's not crazy, because there are other ways to connect to internet, but there is a very strong and statistically significant relationship between 3G access and self-reported internet access by Gallup respondents. And this relationship is kind of a non-parametric relationship, but it's very close to linear relationship, and you see that we don't really have outlier bins. Here we group observations into bins. Now, this is the main result, which is the relationship with 3G and the government approval net of all controls. So we control for region fixed effects. So essentially, it's also, in particular, since we control for region fixed effects, it's also controlling for time invariant characteristics that determine government approval, and in particular, government approval in 2008. And so here you also see a virtually linear relationship between change in 3G and government approval. And this relationship is substantial. So when we move from 0 coverage of 3G to 100%, government approval changes by 6 percentage points. And as I'll show you, the mean government approval in this data set is in the range of 50%. So it's a non-trivial relationship. So this is the regression table that captures those two graphs, where we, first column, we show the relationship between access to 3G and access to internet. And this is this 8 percentage points number. And then I report 4 outcomes that I mentioned before, namely confidence in government, confidence in judiciary system, confidence in elections, and perception that the government is not corrupt. Now you see the confidence variables are all 50% on average. This is the mean dependent variable. The share of people who believe that there is no corruption in government is much lower, 20%. And so the coefficient is slightly lower. But overall, the relationship is quite strong. And then we also aggregate those 4 questions in 2 ways. So first one is the share of yes responses to those questions. So if you like, this is an average of these 4 variables in columns 2, 3, 4, and 5. So column 6 is the average of 2, 3, 4, and 5. And the last column is the first principal component of these 4 questions, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And you see results are similar, substantial, and in magnitude, and statistically significant. So the results are actually even stronger when we move from the full sample to rural locations. And once we look at rural locations, we actually have somewhat stronger impact. So we move from basically from 6 percentage points to 8 percentage points. And again, this is something that we find intuitive because in rural places you have fewer alternative channels of information, of political accountability. In rural places, you also are more likely to get 3G as the main source of internet and political information. So let me now talk briefly about communications. Identification assumptions. So first and foremost, we of course are worried that arrival of 3G is driven by government approval itself or by third variables. And then of course, we want to know whether the expansion of 3G affects confidence in government only through access to internet. And so we provide a number of tests. I'll show you the tests. And we also use this IV strategy, which has been used by Monacorda and TSA, where we predict rollout of 3G networks by frequency of lightnings in this particular location. So this is what we run as tests. And first test is actually a very demanding specification where we introduced fixed effects at the level of country year. So whatever happens in this country, in politics, economics, social affairs, in this year is taken care of by country year fixed effects. So the whole variation is within countries, different regions have different 3G penetration. And turns out that regional 3G coverage is actually still, it's less significant. The magnitudes are smaller, and yet you still have large effect, 4 percentage points instead of 6, but still large effect. And this effect is statistically significant. So we also check if it's 3G that causes government approval. It's not government approval that causes 3G. So we look at lags and leads. And this is the graph which shows lags and leads. And you see that indeed there are no pre-trans. So before 3G arrives, there is no impact on government approval. Once 3G arrives, you have the decline in government approval. And this decline is statistically significant and remains statistically significant a year after and 2 years after. What we also do, we check event study. So we call an event study, an event when a region has an increase of 3G coverage by 50 percentage points. So if you have, for example, 20% of your population having access to 3G, and then next year you have 70+, then we call it an event study of a rapid expansion of 3G. And so we'll look at regions which have experienced this event, and we find 400 regions like this in 60 plus countries. And so the gray line shows you the event. The right axis shows you the scale. So if you normalize to pre-event average, then you see a jump by almost 70%. So on average, the 50 plus event is actually on average 70% coverage. And then we look at what happens to government approval during this event study. And you see that government approval is having no pre-trans, it's exactly 0, and then it goes down and remains lower after such an event study. So we look at those regions. We also look at a placebo treatment for those event studies. What we do, we say, okay, you have those 400 regions in 60 countries. How about we take, say, 200 more regions in the same countries, the same years, and see what happens to them. And we find that in placebo treatment, we find no effect. So regions which have no increase in 3G coverage by 50%, they have no significant impact on government approval. So what else do? We also look at 2G. Now 2G is an important placebo for us because indeed Manacorda and Tessé looked at 2G and found a very important effect from 2G rollout to protests. This is not what we look at. We look at government approval, confidence in government, and we find no effect. So in panel A, we run the regional 2G coverage on, first and foremost, on internet. We find no effect. 2G is not about internet. This is pre-smartphone technology. It's very, you would have some browsing, but it would be completely rudimentary. And so political information would not travel. And on some outcomes, we actually have a positive effect. And on average, we have a positive effect. And first principal component is positive and significant. And we explain that by the fact that when people get new technology, 2G technology, they're actually happy about the government because government has provided regulations and opportunities for investors. And now you have better access to technology. And so you are happier about your government. And then we run a horse race between 2G and 3G, and the results actually don't change in the sense that 3G coverage, especially if you look at columns 6 and 7, is still negatively affecting confidence in government, and 2G coverage affects positively confidence in government. And so how do you reconcile these results with the Manacorda and Tessé impact of 2G on protests? Well, we believe that protests and government approval are different things. Protests are about coordination of political activists who are a minority, who are not representative. We look at normal people. And so normal people apparently like 2G. They don't go to protests. They like 2G per se because they get better life. And once after 2G, they get access to 3G, then suddenly they become more informed about their government and less happy. So this is where we are. Do you have questions by now?
No, we're fine.
No, fine, okay. So since, I'm halfway through my time, let me actually skip the test for selection on observables. So we do Altonji et al. Test and we do Oster test. And basically we find that our results are not driven by selection on observables. Let me say that we also check if our results are driven by any specific time period. For example, period of the crisis of 2008, 2009, or some other periods. And we basically find no outliers in this chart where we break down the effect by 2-year periods. We break our 10 years into 5 2-year periods. Now you see that standard errors are a bit bigger in the first 2 years. That's because Gallup was just rolling out its polls. And so we have fewer observations in this period, but the magnitude is similar, and eventually the results are marginally significant. So let me now talk about IV. So what we do here, we say each region, we can get data on lightning's frequency in this particular region. This is time invariant variable, average frequency of lightnings in the region. And basically, if you have more lightnings, then 3G arrives later because it's costlier to install 3G infrastructure and assure that it functions in a continuous way. And that's why we multiply frequency of lightning by time, T. And then we do a split between GDP per capita above and below median in our sample. Why? Because we think that in richer countries, general quality of governance, quality of infrastructure, access to electricity is better. And so this effect, the first stage, should probably work in a more convincing way in poorer countries. And that's what we find. So in column 1, you see the first stage for regional 3G coverage, and you see that there is a significant coefficient for poorer countries. And then in the second stage, we find very strong result. The second stage coefficient is significant, negative, and quite large in magnitudes. We're having 20 percentage points, while before we used to have 6 or 8 percentage points. Now, what we also do, instead of going for the full sample and splitting the instrument into one for poor countries and rich countries, we also focus on poor countries subsample. So this is the half of the poor country subsample, half of the sample. And we see that here the instrument works. And you see that F statistic is strong, 19 or 14. And you see that coefficient is especially large in rural areas, and both for all regions and for rural areas, coefficient in the second stage is twice as large as in OLS or in panel regression. So this is the reduced form for this strategy, where we split the sample into regions with low frequency of lightning strikes and high frequency of lightning strikes. And on the vertical axis, it's government approval after all controls. And you see that in low lightning frequency, the 3G rolls out slower, so government approval is faster, sorry. So on the left, you see regions where 3G arrives faster, so government approval falls. And actually in regions where you have a lot of lightning strikes, it actually goes up. And the whole chart here is for the poorer half of our sample. So now let me say a few words about heterogeneity of the effect. So the average effect is negative. So more 3G, less government approval. But it turns out that this effect is driven by countries with free internet. When we divide our sample into countries with high internet freedom and high internet censorship, you see that in countries with uncensored internet, you have a strong negative relationship. In countries with censored internet, you have no relationship. You have flat relationship. So you can have more internet access, 3G internet, or self-reported home access to internet, and turns out that it doesn't affect government approval. And now what is important, we look at this variable, access to internet at home as reported in Gallup. And we try to see if in countries with censored internet, they have less internet access. And we don't find that. We see that 3G does deliver you access to internet, but censorship reduces the content of what you get on internet. And that's why, as you can see in the previous slide, you don't get impact on government approval. So it's the content rather than access to internet. So this is the table which puts what I've just shown you graphically into econometric form. And basically you see that you have regional 3G coverage and interaction of regional 3G coverage with internet censorship dummy. So where we put 0 for free countries and 1 for unfree countries. We also do the same with a continuous variable. So this variable goes from 0 to 35. We say above 22 is unfree, and below 22 is free. And basically the results with it, where you have the interaction with the continuous variable, basically gives you also significant coefficient at the interaction. So we also look at the differential impact in countries with and without traditional media censorship. And we find that the effect is stronger in countries which have more censorship of traditional press. So on the left-hand side here is the chart with censored traditional media, and on the right-hand side, there is a chart for countries which have censorship of traditional press below median in our sample. And you see that there is a steeper relationship on the left. And so if we run the interactions, we find that in the data, in this table, on this slide, we show that you have interaction with the censorship of traditional media, and you see that censorship of internet has a positive coefficient and the interaction with the 3G. So the negative impact of 3G is reduced by online censorship, but the traditional media censorship has a negative impact. So the stronger is the traditional censorship, the more negative the effect of internet is. So if you're in a country where traditional media is more censored, you have a stronger impact on negative impact on government approval. So we also run a number of placebos. So does 3G makes you more whiny and less happy? Maybe this is what it is. You spend too much time on the internet and so you're unhappy about everything. The answer is no. We look at the full sample in panel A, we look at panel B, where we look at rural areas. In both cases, we don't find significant results. If anything, the results are positive. So better access to 3G means you're insignificantly but happier. And we look at a number of outcomes which are related to life satisfaction now, life satisfaction in the future, and we find no results. Now, we also have a very important placebo, which is confidence in local police. So this is the proxy for confidence in local government in Gallup. And basically, the only local question that we have in Gallup here has the confidence in local police, and we have no result. And so the way we interpret this zero result is that people don't need the internet to capture the quality, to perceive, to evaluate the quality of local police. They see it in their own eyes, while the national government sits in the capital city, and this is something you cannot see, and this is something for which internet is really important. Now let me say a few words about the link between actual and perceived corruption. So you have questions? Any questions now? No? Okay. Good. I don't see sorry, many questions. So let me try to go around the slides. Okay. Yeah. So we have two tests, and the first test is related to this GC index compiled by David de Forseri and co-authors, IMF economists, who took the texts of the Economist Intelligence Unit country reports. So these reports are provided to investors on subscription basis and tell you what's happening in the country in this quarter or year. And so what Forseri did, they took the texts of those reports and found which of those reports are mentioning bribes, corruption, and so on. And so they build a measure of incidences of corruption using the text analysis of those reports. Now, we think that this is an important piece of information because this is not something that is used for political purposes. This is where Economist Intelligence Unit provides to investors a view to what extent corruption is common or an uncommon problem in this country. And so we take this data, we take country year data from GC, and we try to see if there is an interaction between actual corruption and 3G. And we see that there is a negative interaction, which means if you have more 3G in a region, then you have stronger link between actual corruption and perceived corruption. Now, remember, our dependent variable is perception that government is not corrupt. So the relationship should be negative. And it is more negative if you have more 3G. And we also do a similar thing. So let me show you the graph first, jump to the graph, and then I'll come back to Panama Papers. But on the left-hand side of this slide, you see a graph which shows you the correlation between GC and perception of government not being corrupt. And you see that if you have no 3G, this relationship is non-existent. It's not statistically significant. And then every additional 10 percentage point increase in regional 3G coverage strengthens the relationship between actual corruption on the vertical axis and actual corruption and the perceived lack of corruption. And this marginal effect is reported on the vertical axis. Now, let me go back to our other test, which is Panama Papers. So you probably remember that in April 2016, there was a leak from the documents of a Panama-based legal firm that was one of the major players in offshore business, providing offshore entities services to all kinds of people around the world, including developed countries, including developing countries, probably not really too much for the very poor countries. But in general, that was an unexpected shock where many societies learned that they're more corrupt than they thought. So that resulted in a number of politicians resigning, including, I think, Iceland's prime minister. And in some countries, actually didn't involve resignations, but overall, we treat the Panama shock as an exposure to the true level of actual corruption in a country. The way we measure it, we calculate number of Panama Papers in a country per capita. And so what we do, we then interact 3G with a number of Panama Papers. Also, we split the shock before and after Panama Papers. And we also look at the countries which are most exposed, the top 10% of the sample. And so we use both a continuous variable and a dummy variable for top 10%. And we find that in some specifications, especially in the specifications which we run on the sample where we exclude the low-income countries, we see the relationship becoming more negative. The correlation between actual corruption and perception that government is not corrupt becoming more negative after this exposure to the leak in places where you have stronger 3G coverage. And so, for example, in the last column, you see that before Panama Papers leak, you would have a correlation of 9 percentage points, and then afterwards you would have a correlation of 17 percentage points. So yeah, and this is basically on this graph, we present that result visually. So basically this relationship between actual and perceived corruption being stronger in places that have 3G internet kind of suggests that internet does deliver transparency and accountability. However, the pessimistic camp is worried that maybe it's a technology that not every opposition party can use, and populists are doing better in terms of capturing the benefits of this technology. And so we check this hypothesis using Europe. Europe is relevant in many ways because Political systems are comparable. Political institutions are reasonably robust and democratic. There is also a conventional classification of parties into populist and non-populist for Europe, less so for the rest of the world. And finally, because we know that Europe has experienced a major increase in populism in the last 20 years, but especially actually in the last 10 years. And so it's a great place to have a look at variation in terms of 3G, but also populist vote. And so just as I promised you to show some maps, this is a map of 3G in Europe in 2007. And you see some countries have 0 3G. So Spain would have 0 3G. Well, most of Italy would have 0 3G. But in 10 years, you have actually almost all Europe covered by 3G. And we use subnational regions. And in those subnational regions, in some of them, you still have less 3G than before than in others. And so we use this variation. So what do? We run a regression for incumbent vote share. So basically what we do, we take first year in our data set, take a party which is in power, and we see to what extent the change in 3G results in decrease of this party in the next election. And so again, we aggregate the observations by bins, by equal size bins, and you see that there is virtually a linear relationship without outliers between increase in 3G coverage and the change in vote share of incumbents. There is a negative impact, and the magnitude is something like 9 percentage points. So this is the table where we run various versions of this regression. And so some of those regressions would be exactly as I just said. So you take a district, you look at the incumbent, and you look at the specific election. So we look at the election today, and we look what happens to the incumbent in the next election. Alternatively, we look at the specification where we just say, let's take 2 main parties in the first election in our data set before the rise of populism, and see how they perform over time over the next 12 years in the next 2 elections on average. And we also find this 9 percentage point difference. In the same regression, we look at the panel of district years for populist parties if they're not among top 2 parties running the country in the first observation. And so we also see that populist parties lose if they are running the country. So incumbents actually lose even if they're populists. And we also check that when we split incumbents in the formulation where we control district year and incumbent fixed effects. When we split populist and non-populist incumbents, we see similar effects, similar negative effects for both. And unlike other literature, which argue that a lot of action in rise of populism in Europe is driven by turnout, we see that turnout is important, but the impact on turnout is quantitatively weaker. So what happens to populists who are not in government? Well, the answer is, well, overall, populists benefit from 3G, both right-wing populists and left-wing populists. Both benefit in the range of 7 to 9% vote share as 3G coverage goes from 0 to 1. There is an increase in populist vote shares for left-wing and right-wing populists. When we look at non-populist opposition, there is no significant impact. If anything, the impact is negative, but it's not statistically significant. When we look at Green parties, which is also a pan-European movement, like populist movement, it's also an anti-system movement. We should remind you that we look at the data set which ends in 2018, before 2019 elections, when Green parties actually did so well. But still, in those 12 years from 2007 to 2018, Green parties have not benefited from expansion of 3G. And this is the this is the set of regressions which I just showed you. So here we look at a panel of opposition parties, right-wing populists, left-wing populists, other populists. They exist, but they're actually fewer, and for them we don't have significant results, and if anything, results go in the opposite direction. Total vote share of populists, including left, right, and other, and we find the results of something like 12 or 13 percentage points for total populists. And then green parties, as I said, no effect, and non-populist opposition, no effect. So there is a question why and what the mechanism is. Well, we can only speculate. We don't have a good answer to this question. What is special about populists? Why 3G helps populists to benefit from access to voters through 3G? Well, one option is that online media, social media are better suited for populist message, which is simplistic, short, catchy, and so that travels really fast, gets shared and reshared. And so probably online media are better for delivering this message. But for example, if you look at green parties, so green parties narrative is also anti-system, but it's also complex. So Greta Thunberg says, I don't like you adults in the government because you stole my childhood, but she doesn't say that expertise doesn't matter. She says, listen to the scientists. And then she also says, we should be all together taking responsibility for the planet. While populist message is there are good people and corrupt elites, and some people are not supporting me, but these are bad people. All good people support me, and there is this divide into moral people and everybody else who is corrupt, other, not belonging to the right group of people. So in that sense, this us versus them narrative may be simpler to communicate through online media. So another question is, of course, that 3G and especially social networks were a new communications tool. And this is what literature on populists always emphasizes. The populists or parties like populist parties in history have always been good in using non-mainstream media. Why? Because mainstream media by definition is probably more aligned with mainstream parties. And as populists would say, are captured by the mainstream, by the establishment. And so in order to deliver their message, populists need a new communication channel. And so if you go back in history and look at the first populist, the People's Party in the United States, you would see that they were innovative in using Telegram. And then I encourage everybody to read a recent paper by Katya Zhuravskaya and co-authors on how Nazis used radio, which was a new communications technology, again, to circumvent the mainstream media. And maybe this is what's happening now. And that creates some reason for optimism. If that is the explanation, then maybe mainstream politicians will learn how to use online media. But currently, at least, we have this correlation, which is quite strong. So let me now say a few words about heterogeneity of our results. I've already said that our results are stronger in rural areas. They're also stronger in poorer countries. And again, this is something which is not counterintuitive, because in poorer countries, 3G probably is the best communications media, and the others are underdeveloped. And so it's the channel through which you can get information, especially critical information about the government, while in richer countries you have other communication channels, including newspapers, TV, and so on. And so the effect may be stronger in some parts of the world and not in the others. So we also run heterogeneity by individual characteristics, and let me skip that. So let me say that we have run some robustness checks, including we replaced the measure of development proxied by household income by nighttime light density satellite data, and we got the same results. We also clustered our standard errors with a special correlation adjustment according to Conley by 500 kilometers, 1,000 kilometers radiuses, and from 1 to 5 special lags, and we found the same results. And we also excluded every single country to see if there is one country which drives our European results, and the answer is no. Closest to that, we have Greece, but even when you exclude Greece, you still have significant results. So let me now conclude, since I only have 5 minutes. I may be able to take more of your questions. We basically look at the relationship between expansion of third-generation mobile services and political outcomes. We look at 2 major political outcomes. One is confidence in government, the other one electoral outcomes. For the confidence in government, we look at surveys run by Gallup World Poll from 2008 to 2017, and we find that rollout of 3G mobile internet reduces government approval. Now, we think that this is in line with the accountability, internet as an accountability technology view, the optimistic view, for 2 reasons. One is we show that this effect is present only in the countries where internet is not censored. And second, it is stronger in the countries where internet is free, but traditional media is censored. Our second result, which is important for this interpretation, is that arrival of 3G strengthens the link between actual corruption and perceived corruption. So it's a country where you have higher actual corruption. This is the country where arrival of 3G will inform the public of this corruption. So we find that this is what happens using both this IMF index of global incidence of corruption and the Panama Papers revelations. We also look at electoral outcomes. For that, we focus on Europe. In Europe, we also look at subnational regions, and we look at vote shares. And we look at 12 years of electoral data. And we find that 3G reduces the vote shares of incumbent parties. Now, I have to emphasize again that if populists are incumbents, they also suffer from 3G. But most populists, of course, are not in the government. And in the last 12 years, and 12 years of our data, we show how populist opposition really gains from 3G expansion, both left-wing populists and especially right-wing populists. Left-wing populists gain something like 7 percentage points if you move from 0 3G to full 3G coverage, and right-wing populists gain 9 percentage points. And so if you are critical of populist politics, then you should say that that means that internet is probably not just the accountability technology, but also misinformation technology. So interestingly, other opposition, other non-populist opposition doesn't gain from 3G expansion. So let me stop here, and I'll be happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
All right, Sergei, thank you very much. I'm receiving information from my underground WhatsApp link that the questions during your presentation have been addressed by your co-authors. I will open the floor if there are any additional questions. Michael, I cannot see if anybody's raising their hand.
So if you raise your hands, then I can allow you to talk. I think Margarita had a question via email. Do you want to share it with us? Or maybe I can also start with one question and then the others can jump in. So Sergei, thank you very much for this great presentation. I was wondering, you have when you talk about government approval, you basically, so you say that the populists, they gain from the vote share from the current government. Do you run tests if right-wing governments are hit harder by the introduction of 3G than left-wing governments, because there is a literature on that basically the trust in government depends on the partisanship of the government. And I'm wondering if you are looking at this.
We've not looked at that, and it's a great question, and we should actually check. As I said, one thing which we did was we looked at both incumbents together. So most of the countries are actually run by either center-right or center-left, and which is especially difficult for us, by a grand coalition of the center-right and center-left. And so that makes it very difficult answering your question. So if you think about Germany, which is run by center-left and center-right, the loss of vote share, do we blame it? Yeah, it's a great question, and we need to think how to address that. But in general, we see that joint vote share of the center loses out. Yeah.
Okay,
but it's a great question. Yeah.
Thank you. Any further questions from the audience?
No.
No.
Okay, good.
Okay.
All right, then I think we should close just in time.
Yeah.
Sharp. Sergei, thank you very much for the fascinating presentation. I'm really grateful for this. And unfortunately, you cannot hear our loud applause. But thank you very much then for it.
Thank you. Thank you,
Sergei.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.